Andrew is the chief humanist of the UK
Right.
and one of the most influential humanists in the world, I think it's fair to
This is a
say.
small pool, but if you want,
But you're an enormous whale in it.
oh,
I'm not sure what to
you
think
are.
about that.
That's as we were talking about a moment ago. That's the sort of bit you could edit out.
No, we're leaving that in. We're making that the clip at the beginning, the very first thing that
Or an
people
enormous
see
whale.
of the video. Hello and welcome to Deep Humanism. This is a new type of video, the first time we've ever done this. We're calling it Two Humanists, where myself and Andrew choose two topics from over the past 2 weeks to discuss from a humanist perspective. In case you don't know who Andrew Copson is, you really should. He is what are you, the executive director, the chief
Don't know.
executive? What's your title?
I'm the chief executive of Humanist UK, which I've been doing for a worryingly large number of years now, 15 years this year. And,
15 years this year, congratulations.
15, yeah. And I'm also president of Humanist International, which is the humanist umbrella body globally, of course, but that's only for another few months. I shall be released from that in summer.
Well, when you step down, we'd love to have a retrospective show on everything you've learned. So the two topics we've decided to discuss this session is the inauguration of Donald Trump. Obviously, we have to talk about it. It's the biggest political story in the world over the past couple of weeks. And the progress of the assisted dying bill in the United Kingdom, which is something that humanists have been fighting for a long time. And we've recently seen significant progress on. And Andrew will give us an update on that, and we'll talk about why that's important to humanists. But firstly, Andrew, what do you think about Donald Trump?
What do I think about Donald Trump?
Yeah.
Well, I think you should go first on this. I mean, you've lived in America for many years, and you've worked in America with a humanist group for many years. I mean, I've been talking to some friends in America, especially in humanist organisations. They're all very worried. They've all started their contingency plans, worried about, attempts to target liberal NGOs, including humanist ones, and just worried about their country. But I think you're more likely to have a more intimate take on it, aren't you? What do you think about it?
I did live in the United States for 15 years. I lived first in Boston and then in St. Louis, Missouri. So I saw liberal coastal America and much more conservative sort of middle America, Midwestern America. And in that time, I also traveled a lot around the United States, often to visit humanist groups around the country. And I remember the week when Donald Trump first won the presidency. We had a Sunday meeting of the humanist group that I was working at the time. And it was the Sunday after the election, and he had just won the election. And hundreds of people came to our community to commiserate and to be in community with each other. And it made me really think about, well, why is this so terrible for people with broadly humanistic beliefs? And my sense is because basically Donald Trump, as a politician and as an individual, not to be rude about it, but just to be honest, embodies pretty much every anti-humanistic value. Like, he's authoritarian, he's aggressive, he seems to be resistant to learning anything more than he currently knows, he's unpleasant to people, he's a bully, right? He's always giving people nicknames to put them down. He is incurious about the world and profoundly ignorant. He wants to use the power of government clearly to benefit a small segment of American society, and particularly people who think like him and support him. He's narcissistic in his approach to politics. And all of that is like the polar opposite of what you'd want from a humanist political leader, I think. And I think that's why people with broadly similar values to ours find it so horrifying.
I mean, obviously, I think that's right. I don't know him personally, but his public character obviously makes you think that all those things are true. Politically, of course, he's also very damaging for any humanist agenda. He's in his first term, especially with his appointments to the Supreme Court, he laid the groundwork for really the complete destruction of liberal case law. Certainly, the end of separation of church and state, and the end of keeping the US public life in the US Constitution, non-Christian in the inclusive sense. Clearly, political Christianity and Christian nationalism has come in his wake, and he's made use of those trends to come to power. That's very concerning politically, even before it comes to LGBT rights or the rights of people from other racial backgrounds and so on. So I think I tend to think of these things politically, but it's interesting what you've said, because you're also sort of implying what the figurehead of a nation says about the character and the image they project and what that can do to a society. I think that's very sensible way of thinking about it as well. I mean, no one will pretend that he's a good thing for liberal humanism. That's certainly true.
I feel like one of the major influences a political leader can have on a country is, as you say, portraying a particular type of character and promoting certain virtues or vices in the populace. There's a really interesting piece of research about why people change their minds and vote for one political candidate, and then in the next election they vote for a different one, maybe of a different party. There was a really great book about it which explored the mindset of people who voted for Obama twice and then voted for Donald Trump in his first campaign to become president, because that seems like a real whiplash, a 360? No, a 180 degree.
Yeah. Well, why was it? Why was it?
Well, what they said was that basically people are rarely persuaded to change their political beliefs, but rather political leaders can sort of reach into the grab bag of people's psyche and surface different aspects of their character or their values. And so one of the major effects that a political leader can have is by making people think about specific issues more than other issues, or feel particular ways about specific things more than about other things. And so while you had a leader like Obama who stressed unity and a basic sort of decency of character and getting along with people in a rational, reasonable way, that was brought to the fore in people, and that's how they felt and acted. Whereas when you have a political leader who's really willing to reach for the basest instincts in people, their desire for supremacy, their fear about change, their distrust of people who are different from them, then they can bring those feelings to the front. And I think that that's really interesting how that works out.
Yeah. It's funny that you say that, because, of course, when you start thinking that way, American presidents have a lot in common as well as differentiating from each other. I mean, Obama and Biden and Trump all think, my country's the best. I'm going to kill the terrorists. Look at Obama celebrating the extrajudicial killing of Osama bin Laden and so on, which, maybe you think it's a good thing, maybe I do think it's a good thing, but nonetheless, they're all sort of, they've all got something in common as well. And I think probably the type of personality that you project and the presence you have has a lot in presidential systems, especially, which of course we're not so familiar with in the UK. But probably the image that you present of yourself, never mind the policies, never mind the values, is also presumably very important. And if you're a big character of whatever kind, maybe you just have a bigger impact on the public imagination. I don't know. I mean,
I feel like being a big character has become increasingly important. Maybe it was always like this, I don't know.
I think it probably was, but it's bad for liberal democracy.
I feel the same way. I mean, if you think about in the United Kingdom, the obvious comparison is Boris Johnson, right? A person of a very big character. People love him or loathe him. Yeah, exactly. People with some form of charisma but I think in the case of Johnson, it's striking, at least in my view, the distance between the size of his character and the size of his actual talent and competence. I mean, it seems to be a really big contrast between those two things, and yet many millions of people voted for him. He won a stonking majority, and I find that a bit baffling, or at least a bit depressing as a humanist. I feel like I want people to perhaps vote with their head a little bit more?
Well, because you'd want people in an ideal humanist democracy where, obviously you've got certain institutions in place, rule of law, human rights, and, more or less liberal democratic institutions. You want citizens to behave in a similar manner, don't you? You want them to rationally think through the impact that different governments will have on, the rights of people, on our society, and will they respect the rule of law, and to take all these things for granted, and then to deliberatively, think about their obligations to their neighbours as well as themselves and the world before they cast their vote. But I mean, I don't think people do that very much. And one of the humanists I most admire in the 20th century, Humanist UK members, was the philosopher Susan Stebbing, who right at the dawn of democracy in the UK, which is less than 100 years old, of course, even now, was thinking very seriously and writing about how this was a very dangerous experiment. And, there wasn't that much evidence really that the whole mass of the population as a whole would make good decisions when they were faced with these serious choices. Not just because they maybe, not necessarily because they weren't capable of thinking rationally through these different ways. She didn't take an elitist sort of, oh dear, these people aren't going to be able to do it. She didn't think they'd care enough. She didn't think their lives were so full of other things, as every life was. She even used herself as an example. She said she didn't really want to spend that much time thinking about politics either. She wanted to think about writing and other nicer things and art and music, and so that it was going to be very challenging for a democracy to choose the right people to govern it if citizens didn't really have it in the forefront of their minds most of the time. And most people don't. I mean, most people don't think about politics all the time, or even the doings of their own government all the time. And as Steven Pinker pointed out in his book about rationality, for most people, these aren't even processes that play themselves out in their world. People think of corridors of power being far away, and they don't even think rationally about the things that happen there, really. They think almost mythically about the things that happen there. The corridors of power in Westminster to someone in the village I'm sitting in now where I live, might as well be an episode of The West Wing or, Another Planet, as it is something real, because they're not there and they imagine it rather than knowing it. And so I think that's a problem too. I mean, one of the most dangerous thoughts that's entered my head since, the rise of Trump and the rise of illiberal democracy in Europe and the rise of the re-emergence of political anti-Semitism and the emergence of political Islamophobia and Christian nationalism generally, is this terrible half worry that actually democracy is not the best way to govern societies after all. I don't believe that, by the way. I think that liberal democracy is the best way to govern.
I could see the headlines now. Humanists UK chief exec says democracy not the best way to go.
Clear, fully committed to democracy. But I do think we should. I think we should definitely see the current situation in so strong terms as that. I think the people who were worrying about the advent of democracy in the early 20th century were sort of right. The evidence being that we have failed to produce a citizenship-educated citizenry, really, I think, in that time. And
yes.
And not because people don't care or because they're stupid or because they're ignorant or because they're incapable, but just because there's a lot of other things going on. And it hasn't been to many politicians' advantage either to stimulate citizenship education, really.
Well, I think what you're pointing to is a sort of broader concern about liberal democracy that the twice election of Donald Trump sort of brings to my mind as well. The feeling that such an individual who's so manifestly poorly suited to high office should win election twice surely means that something has failed on a systems level.
Something, isn't he? It's not just him. He's less
right.
interesting in a way than what the forces that have produced him.
Right. And it does raise the question of, okay, well, how should humanists respond when it seems like, I mean, it's possible as a humanist to have a sort of naive faith in democracy and, the autonomy of the people and our ability to govern ourselves. But it seems like the political times in which we're living suggests that it's more complicated than that. And we might need to think, because we should always be skeptical about our own ideas, right? And think that, well, maybe it's time to change some things and to think more radically about how we structure our society to prevent these sorts of problems arising. But I don't really know what those changes might be. And it feels very like we live in uncertain political times where the problem seems so clear, but the solutions seem pretty difficult to grasp. That's at least how I feel.
I think you're right that the specifics might be difficult, but I don't think that the general answer is difficult to alight upon at all. I think that, how should we respond to bad things that happen and the negative forces that produce the bad events? Well, we shouldn't respond in despair, and we shouldn't respond with simply condemnation, and we shouldn't respond simply with disdain. We should respond as humanists, and I know we both agree about this, with positive action. So we've already decided we've got to take action, and it's got to be positive action. So we've got to organise ourselves, contribute to our local communities, contribute politically, and then start to think about the changes in the system as well that would lead to better outcomes politically. I think that's an enormous uphill struggle, of course, because the very problem that's produced these terrible events is the problem of lack of interest in politics more widely, I think, in society, or lack of interest in constructive progressive politics. So it's hard to say, oh well, the answer is we must just all work, try again but try harder, or change the system, because if no one's interested in the system anyway, changing the system is a hard ask. But I think that is the only thing that might bear fruit. So I think that's what we have to do. I mean, I used it as I used the election of Trump as a stimulus to join various groups that were doing various things and donate some more money to them, and think again about the balance of the time that I spend on things that are just for me and things that are for society, and what I could do more to promote things in that latter category. And if we all did that, then of course we might have a chance to achieve some positive changes. Don't you think? Yes.
Yes, I think you're right.
Justified.
There's a certain amount of optimism is justified, or at least hope. The idea that we can change things if we work at it hard enough. I think that's absolutely right. And I remember, having lived through the first Trump presidency in St. Louis, that many community groups and political organizations came together and really felt it as a supercharging moment, and were able to resist some of the worst changes that could otherwise have happened and limit the harm that was caused. I think the worry that I have is that if Trumpism and the other sorts of extremisms that we're seeing festering across Europe right now and across much of the West, honestly, are the result of some sort of systems failure, then you can only kind of shore up the system with this sort of continual effort so long without actually making really big changes that resolve the root causes of these problems. And I can't help but feel that there has been a major failure of political leadership from progressive parties. I mean, I don't know about you. I'm hesitant to admit this on a video, but I have been watching. So Trump came into office, and the first day he did this flurry of executive orders, every one of which was horrific from a humanist perspective. I mean, they're horrible. They're, we're not going to take any asylum seekers. We've decided there are only two sexes, and why even focus on that issue? I mean, it's just all political theatre. But there's something about the willingness to wield power confidently and with immediacy, and to say, now I'm in charge and we're going to do it our way, that I kind of want to see from our government in the United Kingdom. They want a massive mandate. They have a huge majority, and they feel so diffident about imposing their political vision on the country. And I think that's kind of crappy, and I want them to step up. I don't know if you feel the same way. Maybe it's just me.
Well, I mean, I don't know about that. I think certainly, I think that Obama and Biden, issued a lot of executive orders too quite early on in their presidencies, and I mean, obviously Obama started in part in a way to solve the gridlock in the other institutions, but nonetheless, I think that they did. In the UK, I mean, certainly I'd always prefer governments that were going to do, or things that I approved of, or be guided by the sort of values that I think they should go fast and go further than they do. I mean, the Labour government of 1997 obviously did things, at 1997 onwards, did things at an incredible pace, many of which had been on the wish list of the humanist movement in the UK for many years. The Human Rights Act, the Equality Act, so many, Freedom of Information Act, so many sort of society changing steps that have never been rolled back, or at least not yet. So of course I think that in the world as a whole, and the democratic world as a whole, liberal, whether left liberal or right liberal governments, when they get the chance, should do as much as possible, as quickly as possible, because they're not in power typically for very long. either. That's the other issue. But I also think they should take time to address the underlying structural problems
Yes.
in our constitutions and society. Why was the Human Rights Act such an achievement? Why was the Equality Act such an achievement? Actually, because it wasn't just a one initiative, let's increase the funding for this today, or let's make this little policy change or that policy change. It changed the whole architecture of our public life and legal system, right? So from the Human Rights Act onwards, every public authority had to, for the first time, respect and abide by the human rights of every individual in the whole of our public services. And so did government, and you could take legal action against the government if they didn't. Same with the Equality Act. So my question would be not just why aren't progressive government doing more quickly, but why aren't they doing big system changing things in the way that governments led by humanists in the past, especially in the UK, have done. So, for example, who can doubt that the current mess we're in is because the lack of regulation of media and social media? No one can plausibly doubt that, and yet there's no effort, seemingly, to regulate social media, to treat them as publishers, to do anything that might lead to better quality of public debate and public information. There's no serious attempt to grapple with the constitution of the House of Commons, our terrible system, the House of Lords and its political cronyism and illiberal nature. All of these big questions that no attempt to resolve the political problems in our region by deciding how the UK should relate to the European Union. That does sort of seem to be happening. No attempt globally to build up the community of democracies as against the transatlantic economic community that exists. No serious attempt to do that. So I think what I miss would be politicians with some sort of principled long-term vision.
That would be nice.
Of a better world that can be built. That seems to often be lacking, and a lot of even humanistically minded progressive governments in the West have come to power not with a vision like that or a manifesto or an agenda like that, but instead a very bread and butter, which of course is important because people need bread and they need butter. But a very bread and butter sort of, we will manage the economy, we will be technically better at doing that than the other guys. And that, of course, I miss that. But then I like a nice vision and
yes, something inspiring, something grand.
Inspired by these sorts of things. And, if progressive politics in the first part of the 20th century at least, or in the later half of the 19th century as well, was in some ways something that replaced religion in some ways, then it does need to have some inspiration in it and some sort of hope of a better world, as well as a call to action. So yeah, I think that's what I feel about it. I wouldn't just say sort of go further, faster. I would say something different. Keir Starmer did do. I mean, Keir Starmer did give a great.
Okay, defend Keir Starmer. Go for it.
Well, no, because Keir Starmer along these lines. I'm not going to be political in any way, but Keir Starmer in these terms that we're just talking about did give a very good speech about this. I can't remember where it was, but he talked about I think he was talking about the Human Rights Act, and he was talking about human dignity and the dignity of every person and their inalienable dignity, and they were sketching out a vision of the human person in political and legal terms, but not that wasn't an example of a longer term, more hopeful vision for a better world. But maybe he does believe that. I'm sure he does. The other thing is, though, I wouldn't know, would you? I mean, how many speeches of government ministers do you read? I don't read many.
I don't read them, but I try to watch the big ones. I try to watch, I like the rhetoric, and so I try to watch, the relaunch speech that Starmer did not too long ago when they were like, oh, we're going to relaunch the government. They just got into government, feels like, and they're relaunching already. But yes, I do feel like a sort of dearth of vision. I think they're getting better at talking about values. I think you're right about some speeches that talk more effectively about what is animating them. But it's like, well, you have to connect your values to some concrete political project because, politics is what values look like in practice.
I mean, that's right, because politics is obviously extremely important for anyone with a humanist view, because this world is all there is, and politics is the way that you make it better. I mean, there is no other shared enterprise that's going to deliver that. So it's all we've got, and I think that, well, you should go into politics then. I mean, there you go. What we're really ending up with here is an argument that if you're a humanist, you should get more involved in politics.
Yes, I'm launching my campaign for Mayor of Brighton right now.
Are you Mayor of Brighton? There isn't a Mayor of Brighton, is there?
There is a Mayor of Brighton, not an directly elected mayor.
I mean, I try and get stuck in locally. I chair our parish council, and I do political things on issues from time to time, and try to log with my MP and get involved at election time with things, which is good. I think more people should stand as councillors, more people should contact their MPs, more people should join political parties if they can find one they agree with. More people should get involved in movements of all kinds, especially ones with practical aims and outcomes.
I definitely agree with that, because one of the most hopeful things for me recently has been getting stuck back into British electoral politics. You know, I jumped ship from the Liberal Democrats myself and joined the Green Party, which had a real chance of winning in Brighton, where I was living. So, you know, it made sense to campaign for them.
Did they win? They won in the seat that you live in?
They won in Brighton Pavilion, which was not where I lived, but right next to where I lived. And I spent a good 6 weeks doing a lot of volunteering for that campaign, and I took even a week off work just before the election and did a full week of canvassing, going door to door, knocking on people's doors and speaking to them about the election. And I tell you, it was really heartening in the sense that people really did care about the election. They had strong feelings about it. They sometimes weren't always the most well-informed feelings. There is a lot of misinformation out there, and you mentioned the challenge of social media and how it's increasingly promoting all sorts of nonsense that infects the political discourse. But people did care, and they were willing to talk about politics most of the time, and they were very sweet most of the time as well. And so it was quite heartening to be involved in the political process. So if you're feeling down about the inauguration of Donald Trump, you want something to do, join a political party, get involved in a local campaigning group, actually do something alongside other people, because I've always found that gives me a greater sense of agency and a greater sense of hope. Now, you mentioned a little bit ago some of the key humanist kind of list of political desirables that were achieved by the last Labour government. We're about to talk about another one of the things that we've been fighting for a long time, which is assisted dying, the right of people essentially to have a doctor help them end their lives when they are terminally ill. And can you tell us a little bit about the history of the humanist fight for this and where we are right now?
Sure. I mean, in the UK, but around the world, humanists have typically prioritised freedom of choice and agency, and the law giving greater space for that for people in the way they live their lives. And, you know, 100 years ago, this agenda was obviously seen in campaigns for divorce law reform, campaigns for abortion law reform, campaigns for decriminalisation of homosexuality, and all sorts of areas in which the state still took an excessive interest in the way that you lived your life and the choices that you made essentially about your private existence, and certainly the choices that you made about your own body, which is the most obvious and intimate of private existences. And so out of that long list of manifesto points that humanists had in previous decades, really any move at all on assisted dying for those who are incurably suffering or terminally ill is the only one to which there's been no move at all really in the UK anyway. Now obviously there are jurisdictions around the world that have introduced assisted dying. In all those countries, humanist organisations have usually played their part in pushing for those changes and in helping them to be practically implemented when they come along. And now it's our turn. So I mean, there's a bill going through the Scottish Parliament, or that will shortly start making its way through the Scottish Parliament. And then, of course, there's the bill certainly that I've been most involved with, which is the one in England and Wales. It's a peculiarity of the Westminster system that when things come along that are thought of as big moral questions, instead of the government taking a bill through Parliament on them, it's left to individual MPs on their private initiative to take bills through. It's interesting always to sort of contemplate what government thinks is a moral question and is not. So, abortion, that's a moral question. Decriminalisation of homosexuality, that was a moral question. But apparently, asylum, or the Human Rights Act, or, poverty, these aren't moral questions in the same way.
That is weird.
The government does take action on those. Anyway, never mind about that. Well, it is slightly relevant because one of the problems that is going on in Parliament at the moment is that because it's not a government bill, the bill to allow assisted dying, but instead a bill brought by a private member, of course, it doesn't have the same resources of government behind it. And so there are lots of questions that Kim Leadbeater, who's been doing a brilliant job, she's the MP bringing the bill, there's lots of questions that she's being forced to get expertise on externally. She can have some draw on the resources of government, obviously, as a private member, but not as much as if it were a government bill. So it puts an enormous burden of responsibility on one particular individual member of Parliament. Anyone can see, I think, from the way things have been going on in Parliament, that she is being well supported by other members of Parliament around her. But nonetheless, it's a lot. It's a lot to carry this over the line yourself. So the bill has had its second reading, which is where MPs say whether or not they're for or against the principle of a bill. So in this case, MPs voted in favour of the principle that physicians should be permitted to prescribe self-administered fatal drugs to people who are terminally ill.
So just let's pause there and clarify, because I think it's really important for people to understand what the bill does and doesn't do. So physicians will be, what did you say? They're permitted to prescribe self-administered lethal medication. So the person who is terminally ill, and they have to be terminally ill.
They have to be terminally ill, and they must be terminally ill. And
they take the medicine themselves.
They must take it themselves. So unlike some other jurisdictions, like, for example, Canada is the most obvious one, but there are others too, like Belgium or the Netherlands. There will not be any medical administration of this. There won't be any sort of injection or any sort of physician intervention in the act of a person dying. The person will have to administer the fatal dose themselves. There are other places that are also like that.
And we would legalise this. And I guess I wanted to ask, the moral question.
Safeguards.
Yes, tons of safeguards. I mean, it's a very, very rigorous bill that is trying to ensure that this is as done as carefully as possible.
It goes through, yeah.
And you said earlier that humanists, we believe that this is the only life we have, right? Agreed?
Yeah.
And people might think it's unusual then that humanists should advocate for the ability to end your life. People might instinctively think, well, if this is all we've got and there's nothing after this, then we should have as much of this as we possibly can, and we shouldn't let people end their lives. Why do humanists think that, no, morally people should have the right to end their lives?
Yeah. I do know, one or two people, a very, very small minority of humanists, who would advocate for that other view, the view that, because life is so short, it should be continued, and that every moment of living gives the potential for some sort of meaning, whatever it might be. But that's a small minority. I mean, we know, for example, over 95% of humanists in opinion polls agree with assisted dying. So this is a very small minority, but nonetheless, it is a possible position. But surely I think the most obvious humanist position is that quality of life is what matters rather than quantity, and not quality as judged by someone else, but quality as judged by yourself. And I think that that's the important point here, is that if life is something to which has meaning insofar as we give it meaning ourselves, then of course happiness and fulfillment in life becomes more important, and you're the only judge of that. Now, suicide is legal, of course. Anyone could, although we all hope that anyone we know and love wouldn't make this choice. Anyone is able to end their life. the specific question in this bill is when should people be assisted to do so, and that's when criteria such as either terminal illness or incurable suffering that can't be resolved and goes on for, is intractable, they become the factors that are important. And everywhere that has introduced in the world that has introduced some sort of medical assistance in dying has limited it to people who are terminally ill or intractably suffering, and that's really what this is about. So it's not about length of life; it's about quality of life, and it's not about even This bill is for the terminally ill, but of course we all know many of the cases that have gone to the Supreme Court in the UK have been brought by people who aren't terminally ill but whose suffering is intractable. And I would say I'd be one of those who would say that actually proximity to death isn't the most important factor here. Intractability of suffering is the most important factor, but I think we're a long way from that still in the UK. I don't think that Parliament would contemplate a law that had non-terminally ill but incurably suffering people included within it. So we are where we are to that extent, and it is about the terminally ill. And I think the values of it are quite clear.
Yes, I find them clear.
It's choice. Choice is the most important value. Some people would say dignity, and I do agree with that to some extent, but I do worry about the use of dignity too much, because it implies somehow that, if you're reliant on others, if you have to receive personal care of some kind, that this is somehow an indignity. And I don't think that's very, I don't think it's true. I don't think the giving or receiving of even very intimate personal care is an indignity to every person. Some people might find it to be an indignity, but others, would not. And I think you have to be very careful about that sort of language when it comes to people who are in these sorts of positions. I mean, I remember very early on hearing someone talk, not a humanist, actually, as it happens, talk about the suffering of someone in a wheelchair and how awful it would be to be in a wheelchair. And I thought, that was a terrible thing to say. I mean, it's pure ableism, really, because there are many people in wheelchairs who are, after all, disabled not by that, but disabled by society. I mean, I believe in the social model of disability myself, so I mean, I would react very strongly against that. So dignity is important, but only because it's a matter of personal feeling. I think the most important moral concept to issue is choice.
Choice. And I think what you say that stuck with me too is this idea that it's the intractability of people's suffering and quality of life. I always think, when I think about this issue of my father, who died a few years ago of cancer, and I saw him very closely. I saw him on the day that he died, and I could see how incredibly he was suffering. And if I can imagine that he might have had to live like that for many more months, wanting to die, but being not allowed. I mean, it would have been incredibly cruel to essentially say, no, we're going to force you to stay alive against your will. We're not even going to let you take medicine that would end your life, because we think that that's best for you, regardless of what you think is best for you. I have a revulsion about that. I think it's horrible.
Yeah, I mean, we all think of the people that we've loved who've gone through this, don't we? When we engage with this question, I think that's why such a high public interest in this discussion, because we're all going to die. That's the first thing. But everyone knows someone also in their own family or friends who suffered. And I think in exactly the same way as you've just said about your dad, I think about my grandma. I remember when she was quite close to the end, and basically was told, well, this is a couple of weeks or whatever, and she said her life was very limited by this point, and she said to the doctor, what happens now? I was waiting to die. And the doctor said yes, and she sort of couldn't believe this or accept it. I mean, she willed herself to death a lot earlier. She was one of these classic, like my great grandmother, her mother actually, sort of turn your face to the wall, no food please, suicides. And so
And that's one of the horrific things about the British system, as I understand it, is that you are actually allowed currently to refuse food.
And the NHS has to facilitate that.
Yes, so they have to facilitate you starving yourself to death,
right.
but they are not currently allowed to give you medication that would help you die. I mean, that is a contradiction of monstrous proportions, and it doesn't make any sense.
Well, let's hope that it will be resolved by this present bill. I mean, the bill still has a lot of hurdles. The opponents of the bill are going to, we already see the sort of amendments they're trying to propose to it to make the process more restrictive, more onerous, more difficult to access. This bill is already the most restrictive, most onerous, most difficult to access assisted dying bill in the world. So to make it even more restrictive is it's going to require a pretty special effort, but nonetheless.
Yeah. Where is that impetus coming from? Like, who is against this? You've said that humanists have been fighting in favour of this form of liberty, this form of autonomy for a long time. Who's against it?
The biggest single predictor of how people voted on it in the House of Commons was actually religion. So you can draw a straight line from Protestants on the one hand, right down to, or right up, let's do it that way, to make the non-religious point sound better. Protestants on the one hand, and the non-religious on the other hand. And along the way, you get, Catholics, Sikhs, Jews, Hindus, and so on. But, religion was the single biggest predictor, stronger than party, stronger than sex, stronger than region. Yeah, the biggest single predictor of how MPs voted in the House of Commons was religion. Now, that didn't mean, of course, that the reasons they gave were religious reasons necessarily. So the other reasons given were mostly to do with some sort of slippery slope. So the idea that if it were permitted for if assisted dying for people who wanted it with terminal illnesses was permitted, that eventually we would get to a situation where either people who didn't really want it or who had been coerced in some way, or people who weren't terminally ill, or whatever factors outside of the current bill would eventually be permitted. And that slippery slope argument was, in essence, the major argument against. There were some arguments from people representing organisations that campaign on disability rights, the rights of disabled people. Those arguments were sometimes difficult to understand because they were often not relevant to the bill as it's written. They would have been relevant if the bill had gone further and had been intended to cover people who were not terminally ill but were intractably suffering. But they weren't directly relevant in most cases to the actual text of the bill itself. However, obviously the concern from some of those groups was real. Must have a minor digression here just to point out that most people with disabilities in the UK in opinion polls are as supportive or more supportive than people without disabilities of assisted dying. So,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so the disability rights organisations shouldn't be seen as speaking necessarily for the majority of people with disabilities, but nonetheless they were raising valid points. I mean, people with disabilities are treated appallingly in this country still. I think it's probably, my own view is, it's probably one of the characteristics in the Equality Act where progress has been worst in the years even since the Disability Discrimination Act. So there's lots of reasons to be concerned there on their part. Not, I think, reasons that should mean that no one can have assisted dying, but reasons that mean that we should have adequate safeguards built in. So it's mainly that. There were one or two, as there always are in a large House of Commons, one or two niche reasons. It's particularly interesting to hear one Member of Parliament speaking about her particular worries that women in particular would be coerced through domestic coercion by men into assisted dying. She wanted protections on that. So there's 100 reasons in general. But I would always come back to the fact that the strongest predictive factor in the voting intention of an MP was religion, whether they declared it or not.
And that makes this a very interesting issue for us to talk about, as two humanists, because it's such, even it sounds like even when people were offering ostensibly secular arguments in favor of their position, the predictive power of religion in terms of determining what people were going to vote at the end suggests that there is some sort of significant difference in how people view life that is related in some way to people's religious views. And that makes sense. I mean, the humanist perspective on life is distinct in important ways from that of most religious perspectives on human life. And I guess it might be interesting to try and characterize the difference. I suppose part of it is, it's not just that this is the only life that we have, it's also that what is important about it is what's important to us about it. I mean, maybe that's a way of putting it. Yeah. And that it's not, our life is not important because it was made by someone or something else to achieve something that is part of their agenda. And therefore, we have more of a emphasis on our own decisions and our own judgment about our own quality of life. And that's kind of the distinction between the idea of human beings as being a natural organism and being specially created for some bigger purpose as part of a bigger plan. Does that capture a difference there?
I agree with that. I also think something about the fact that we are ourselves creative beings, and that we are the ones who endow our own existences with meaning and purpose and significance. And I think that's an important, it's just an elaboration on what you've said, but I think it's an important aspect of it, is that, we are the authors of our own stories in that sense from a humanist point of view. And I think that matters in these big choices. I also think maybe there's something that to be a little bit more political about it, small p political about
Never.
it. No, small p. In that, perhaps people with religious ways of thinking are more keen on protecting the things they value by having hard and fast rules or taboos around certain concepts. The sanctity of life came up quite a bit, and the idea that if we moved away from the idea that it was never right for any medical assistance, then we might, quickly come to the position where it was always right for medical assistance to be brought. This idea that you protect things you value by taboos and hard and fast, incontrovertible rules, whereas a more humanist view saying, well, look, it's not either or. Context is always important. We are able to construct systems of rules and safeguards and processes that will allow for choice in complicated circumstances. Every situation is different. That's another possible difference.
There's something really interesting philosophically there. I think you're right that many religious ways of seeing the world have this sort of value hierarchy in which some values are seen as foundational to everything, and if they're infringed upon in the smallest way, everything is going to fall apart, whatever that value is. And I feel like humanism is more a sort of a balance and a network of values which are sometimes in tension with each other. It's complicated. It's sort of, well, yes, but there's always a sort of melange of considerations. And the difficult work is to come to an appropriate way to navigate between the different considerations rather than to ring fence one and say that's the thing on which everything rests.
Absolutely. And I would say not just, you mentioned in contrast with religious ways of thinking, but I would say not just in contrast with some religious ways of thinking, but also in contrast with some secular ways of thinking that are still non-humanist, political doctrinaire ways of thinking or economically doctrinaire ways of thinking. I think a humanist view has to stand against any unquestionable doctrine, and never really, I don't think humanists should ever be saying that the way to protect this or that good thing or good value is to put a cordon around it and say it can never be questioned, it must never be infringed, it must never be doubted. That just can't be the way.
Andrew, I entirely agree with you, except for one thing. There is one uncontrovertible doctrine, and that is that you should like this video and subscribe to the channel. Folks, this has been our first attempt to do a two humanist discussion. I've been James Croft. My co-host who is going to be doing this with me forever, hopefully.
Oh my goodness.
Until we decide we want to end our existence because it's become too intolerable.
What am I doing? I'm just talking to you on a video. I don't know what happens next. I don't know how you do the thing.
And you're never going to watch this, are you? You're never going to watch it back.
Of course I'm not.
Never. Oh my gosh. So my co-host has been Andrew Copson. Thank you for watching our first attempt at doing a Two Humanists video, and we hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you in the depths. I have to say that at the end of every video. That's my sign-off, Andrew. It's really cheesy.
What you're going
well, it's because it's called deep humanism. It doesn't mean anything.
Oh.
It's just you have to, at the end of a YouTube video, everyone watching this will understand, you have to have some kind of bullshit phrase that you say. I've learned this from watching countless other YouTube videos.
I see.
Yes.
I remembered all the phrases they've used.
Yes, you have to start them. I didn't do this, but you have to start them by going, yo, 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 bros, welcome to my channel, like and subscribe. I should do that more. It would make it more successful.
You should, because I'm not going to.
You're not going to.